Hello, salam, welcome. This is Adnan Hussein, professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history at Queen's University, with another episode of the brilliantly and creatively named Adnan Hussein Show. And as I had mentioned in the channel intro, in addition to geopolitics and left history, I wanted to expand and talk a little bit about religion, comparative religion, spirituality, and topics like that. And so for the very first episode where we start exploring some aspects of that, I knew that I wanted to talk with my upcoming guest and collaborator from the past on Guerrilla History, Breht O'Shea from Revolutionary Left Radio. We'll talk a little bit more with the idea for this episode, but firstly, welcome, Breht, to the show.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I always support everything you do, and it's really exciting to see this new show get launched, especially on YouTube, which is an area that, in our past work we haven't really done too much work on. So yeah, I'm happy to be here, and it's an honor.
It's terrific. Well, maybe you could tell listeners a bit about yourself. I think probably most people who are coming to this channel might know you, but there might be new people who don't know about your work. So go ahead and introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm a father of three. I'm a local organizer, have been for many, many years here in Omaha, Nebraska. And out of those organizing efforts years and years and years ago, we needed something to confront political education in the context of local organizing. And so after a few discussions and meetings, I decided that my friend Dave had a bunch of music recording software. This is like in 2016, 2017. And that I was kind of a fan of podcasts, and maybe we could do a podcast format that would just be distributed locally to people in Omaha at that time. So we did a couple episodes, and it took off way more than we expected. And so I'm the host of Revolutionary Left Radio, over 8 years on air, the co-host of Red Menace, which is more theoretical. We tackle texts within the Marxist tradition, but we cover reactionary thinkers, and we do different things. We also cover current events when they pop up, with my good friend and co-host Allison, former co-host of Guerrilla History. And so that's kind of who I am. That's my background. And I've always been interested in Buddhism, Buddhist meditation, mysticism more broadly. And so I've always tried to weave that in to the shows in various ways. And as luck would have it, Adnan is also interested in that stuff, and Allison is also independently interested in that stuff. So it comes up from time to time, and we try to infuse our politics with at least a recognition of these traditions.
Right. Well, I mean, and that's the reason why I wanted to bring you on, because in fact, as somebody who is a historian, a leftist, broadly speaking, engaged with, activism for liberation, against racism, against capitalism, that is sometimes a space that's purely secular in the way in which politics is envisioned, and very often religious commitments or spiritual orientations, particularly, say, mysticism, seems almost antithetical, or not almost, absolutely antithetical to the materialist historical approach and the secularity. And so I was really thrilled when we teamed up with you, and I discovered even more. I had listened to some of Revolutionary Left Radio episodes, but I hadn't come across the ones that discussed Buddhism and some of your other interests in spiritual and mystical topics. Those, in fact, came out over the course of the last few years. Many more. I think you've tended to explore those even more. And I was really delighted to connect with somebody on the left who shared many of my political analyses, but also combined it with something about spiritual life and spiritual orientation, because that's not altogether that common. And I think we ended up participating on a program to commemorate Michael Brooks' Spirituality on the Left. And also, I think I came on as a guest on Revolutionary Left Radio to talk about Sufism, so the mystical dimensions of Islam. And those are conversations that I've really enjoyed so much, a conversation about St. Francis of Assisi. And so I just wanted to continue those, partly because this is a topic I want to explore on the new channel, but also, we're right at the cusp of Ramadan, and perhaps I'll have something to say a little bit later about that. But it's a time for spiritual renewal and commitment and discipline and really reflection on one's life over the course of the month of fasting. And so it seemed like a really wonderful opportunity to talk with somebody who has got commitments to a spiritual life, even outside of the tradition of Islam, but to have that kind of discussion. And I noticed that recently you've had some wonderful conversations with Allison, who I had not known had any of these orientations. I mean, I had listened to Red Menace and been absolutely always completely impressed by the brilliant analysis that Allison offers on theoretical and philosophical questions. I had no idea about these spiritual orientations as well. And I learned so much and connected so much with those conversations. So I thought not to recapitulate any of those and cover exactly the same ground, but almost as a continuation and resonating conversation with those that you've had on Revolutionary Left, I wanted to bring you on. And so I thank you so much for making yourself available. To begin, I just wanted to maybe ask a little bit more about your own interest in mystical spirituality and how you have connected that with your other more obvious political and intellectual commitments.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, I'm interested in transformation, right? I apprehend life phenomena, internal and external, as an ongoing process, and this is kind of core to dialectical materialism within the Marxist framework, which is that everything is in a constant state of evolution, right? And in dialectical materialism, it's driven by internal contradictions, and there's this unfolding that occurs in human history over time, right? And what Marxism seeks to do in particular is find those mechanisms, those laws of motion, if you will, and to try to apprehend that phenomena so that we can actually intervene in that process and push it in a more egalitarian, just direction. So that's always been an interest of mine. I grew up and still am very working class, and my experiences in the working class pushed me to the left. I saw the limitations of liberalism. I moved leftward politically. But also always, I was interested in internal transformation. I was interested in the process of development that unfolds internally. And what I've been really interested in the last several years is trying to combine those two things. And we can get more into the contradictions or the tensions or why people on the Marxist left, with the history of atheism that it has, might be hesitant to engage in that. But fundamentally, I have dedicated many, many years of my life, specifically in the Buddhist tradition, and I have seen firsthand and experienced firsthand the transformative power of spiritual practices, of engaging in stillness and silence, of dedicating part of your life to going deep inwardly. And I've seen the benefits that have accrued for me and others on the path, and I can see that it is a singular process, right? Outwardly, humanity wants to evolve. It wants to progress. It wants to continue, building something better, right? We understand we're at a crucial historical juncture right now, where the way that things have been going for the last 500 years with European colonialism, with the past couple centuries with capitalism, it has hit its limits, its spiritual limits, its ecological limits, its economic limits. And something has to give, that something has to change if we are going to live in a better way that is accessible to more people and in harmony with the natural world. And I think there's an internal component to that. I think that humanity also wants to grow up inwardly. And part of that mystical or spiritual transformation is to begin to chip away at the ego identity, this rigid, fear-based control mechanism within us that fundamentally makes us feel separate from other human beings and the world, that makes us want to dominate nature because it scares us and we don't have control of it, that makes us want to dominate others because they scare us and we don't have control of them, and their identities, insofar as they diverge from our own, are threats implicitly to our own. And so if we want to build a better world, we can go a long way just through political struggle. And we've seen people in the past do exactly that. I don't want to ever take that off the table as at all possible if we don't also do this inner work. But I think there is ultimately a limit if we stay within what could be called ego consciousness, this false sense of a tiny separate self. And that we operate from that, we limit what we can do externally. So I think primarily as a Marxist, I'm always going to default that political struggle, organizing, and outward transformation is primary. But I think it's complementary and dialectically in dialogue with and connected to that outward struggle is the inward transformation. And mysticism, if we want to use that word, it can be seen as a tendency within every major religious tradition. So I see every major religious tradition, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, go down the line, as a spectrum, right? And along that spectrum, you have institutionalized, rigid, hierarchical religion. You have, on the far right side, almost every religious tradition has hardcore reactionary, violent, hierarchical, obsessed figures and movements. And then you go more leftward on that spectrum, and you see liberation theology, you see socially engaged Buddhism. Every tradition has elements of that. And maybe it's off the spectrum somewhere, but there's a mystical tendency in every single religious tradition. And that mystical tendency is fundamentally about experience, right? It's not about belief. It's not about hierarchy. It is about deep engagement, often with strategic uses of attention to what is happening right now, that seeks to experientially go inwardly and open something up, right? Transform something. And we can get more into what that process looks like. But for me, it's always been driven by suffering. So growing up into my teens, there's issues with my family. We all have issues, right? To be a human being is traumatic in its own right. We all struggle with forms of suffering. And I realized that the things on offer by our dominant society as a way to address that suffering or that void at the center of being is consumption, is chasing fame, chasing wealth, chasing status, right? This hamster wheel of chasing desire after desire. That's kind of what is given to us, is like, if you do these things, you can maybe be happy. Advertising is built implicitly around this idea of like, get this product, that'll fill a hole in your soul, that will make you a little bit happier. And, more or less, most of us try that out. Some of us take a lot longer than others to realize how empty it is. But most of us eventually bump up against the fact that, constantly satiating desire, constantly seeking consumption, constantly seeking hedonistic experience, chasing fame and wealth and money and status, these things are deeply empty. And eventually we realize I will never get anything like happiness, or even deeper than that, connection, which I think is what the alienated modern subject really wants, a deep sense of unity with nature, with something bigger than themselves, with other human beings. I will never get that through consumption. I will never get that through selfish desire. And once you bump up against that brick wall, you start looking for alternatives. And for me, Buddhism, through happenstance and coincidence, is something I bumped into very early as a late teen, early 20-something. And I've been pursuing it ever since. And I've had experiences of deep love and deep connection, as brief as they were, that really showed me that there is something here. And then I widened my lens and I saw Sufism. I saw the Kabbalah tradition in Judaism. I got into Christian mysticism, like, whoa, there's, Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism and Indian philosophy. I'm like, even Taoism, whoa, there is a universal process here. It's articulated through certain histories and cultures and religious traditions, but there is something profound here that almost every culture, through time and across space, some small minority have bumped into. And they use the same words. They come back to this idea of connection. They come back to no self or selflessness or big self. They come back to ideas of transcendent love. And so that's been now an intellectual curiosity of mine, is to find these threads in the human experience and say, what is here? What can this develop into? How accessible is this? And how does this come into dialogue with revolutionary outward political transformation?
Well, that's so interesting. There are many threads that I'd love to explore more in what you said. Very profound and personal thoughts and experiences. One thing, though, that I'm reminded about is particularly your sense of contemporary crisis. I think you're absolutely correct that modern life, contemporary life, the circumstances under which we're living, socially, ecologically, it's very unfulfilling. And in fact, there is a kind of crisis of real purposeful, meaningful life that I think tends to push people towards seeking alternatives. I think, unfortunately, for the left, is that while there might be a very cogent intellectual critique, very often questions of psychology and emotion and spirit are not front and center because they feel or seem to be less material, less observable. And we have this tradition, of course, of looking at social and historical and material conditions, the economic basis of life as very foundational and fundamental for understanding power. And our whole critique, on the left is based on that criticism of capitalism. But one thing that the right wing seems to do is actually be able to try and offer. I don't think these are genuinely successful responses, but they seem to offer something that individuals who are seeking some alternative, something different, some sense of meaning and purpose to replace the atomization, the competition, the alienation of modern life, to provide community and to give it a rationale around kind of family and tradition and kind of recognizing that there is a crisis, for example, of masculinity. This is something we talked about on Guerrilla History, and we've had some conversations about this. And one thing that it seems is missing very often, in leftist organizing and critique, and what it offers is it may offer answers, it may offer solutions, but it doesn't always offer experiences that people feel speak to them, or they're not necessarily consciously attracted by the cultural, psychological, or even spiritual component of the left. And that needs to be really developed. And I think much of what you're talking about is responding to that crisis of meaning, that critique, that it is impossible really to be happy, in consumer capitalism. And in the way in which it just absolutely feeds desire to acquire, to control, to dominate. Like, these are actually unhealthy reflexes. So I was just wondering if, maybe you had some more thoughts about how one can portray and connect what is a real experience that people are having with forms of spiritual meaning. I think partly a lot of people just think being involved in activism, is its own therapy. And it may be for some people as an outlet, and it forges bonds of solidarity. But I do think that perhaps more is needed or required to reach a broader community of people. And so I'm wondering if you have any further thoughts on, how this can be integrated into, left, not just left politics, but a left program of really saying life could be different. Because that's the whole point, is, to think otherwise, to live otherwise is the goal. That, there has to be some sort of vision, and it has to feel real, and it has to speak to people's needs and experiences in some way in order for it to be realizable or achievable.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a multifaceted question, and I can maybe address some points of it, but it's hard to get around the entire thing. One aspect of this is that crisis is a necessary driver of change. All throughout history, just put on the Marxist lens for a second, the shifts from mode of production are always from slavery mode of production to feudalism to capitalism. They're driven by internal contradictions. They're driven by class struggles, and they're driven by the previous system breaking down under the tensions of its own logic, right? The core premises of a system begin to deteriorate, stop making sense, generate more crises than stability, and that gives rise to the forward momentum for a new system, consciously or just organically. This occurs, and internally, if you want to put on the spiritual glasses, crisis and internal suffering, feelings of depression, of utter alienation, of hyper fear of mortality, anxiety. These are often physiological movements within ourselves that are urging us to address something. And so kind of seeing crisis as a way in which transformation happens. If we were all comfortable all the time, if everything went smoothly, there would be no impetus to grow, both individually and collectively. What we're living in now, collectively and politically, is the breakdown of the capitalist mode of production. It's more and more illogical. It's fundamentally irrational. It's bumping up against its ecological limits. It's devastating people's mental health, people's vision of a future. It fuels alienation, which is this sense of complete disconnection from your society, from any value system, from yourself in so many different ways. And Marx talks about this in depth, about how alienation is this product of private property ownership in the capitalist mode of production. But as it stops working for more and more people, as it bumps up and causes more and more suffering for more and more people, there is this need that is felt by human beings for change. Now, how do reactionaries come into this? Reactionaries come in and say, it's not capitalism per se. It's not the people with all the money and the wealth that are the real problem. Maybe a sliver of them are corrupt and evil, the Democrats, the liberal part. But what's really happening is that we've lost some romanticized past. We've lost some mythologized way of being in the past that if we can just return to, right, we can regain the happiness and the stability that we think was present back then. Now, this is nostalgia. Nostalgia is always kind of a trick. It is rose-tinted glasses looking back on the past. That past actually never existed. But that is one way in which reactionaries say something's happening. There's definitely a widespread feeling, no matter what your politics are, that this can't go on as it is. And we're going to look to a romanticized past. We're going to point out scapegoats in society that are causing the problem, right? Go back to the Nazis, and they're pointing at Jews. They're talking about homosexuals. They're talking about Romani people. Today, it's the immigrant. It's crime. It's minorities. It's the liberal elite who are trying to, flood our societies with immigrants to destabilize us. So there's always an enemy, there's always a scapegoat, but it's always a diversion from the actual thing that's happening. What the left has on our side is an actual analysis of what's really going on. This mode of production no longer works for the most of the people. It is fundamentally breaking down. Its inner logic, its contradictions are coming to a head, right? It produces massive amounts of wealth, concentrates it to the very top. I just saw a stat yesterday that in the United States, 50% of all consumer spending is done by the top 10% of Americans. So half of all consumer spending in our economy is done by a relatively small sliver of the population, because of course they have the disposable income to go out and freely consume. That is a top-heavy system. There's the ecological contradictions, that capitalism is a system that is always and everywhere searching to grow. If it stops growing, it dies. What we call a recession is simply that capitalism hasn't grown over a quarter period, 3-month period, and now we're technically in a recession. So it's cancerous in that it needs to continue to push boundaries. And what does that actually do on a finite planet? Well, it creates ecological catastrophe. It externalizes the pitfalls of production onto poor communities, onto the natural world, destroys rainforest, destroys the biosphere, causes the sixth mass extinction. So we can see all these things piling up, and we know something needs to happen. But in our society, the idea that would be socialism has been ideologically attacked for decades, right? Coming out of the Cold War, but even before that, the system as it is always going to try to defend itself ideologically. And the real solution to capitalism's problem is to transcend capitalism, right? To bring production under collective democratic control for the benefit of the many, right? In sustainable and rational alignment and balance with the natural world, which is the premise of our very existence. And that is obvious, but to do that would take away the power, the privilege, and the wealth of the people who own everything, including our governments. So that's off the table. And so you have people that are already conditioned into a capitalist ideology. Their imagination is radically restricted by that ideology. And then a reactionary will come along and say, what the real problem is, those powerless people over there, they'll play into race, they'll play into gender wars, they'll play into the culture war. And this romanticized vision of the past, they want to go back there. Now, if you ask a reactionary or an American conservative today, like, what is this golden age? They'll say something like, I don't know, the 50s seemed pretty good. That post-war period. Okay, what made that post-war period good for a segment of white America, right? A white middle working class America that, you could support a family on one income. It was post-war New Deal economics. Now, the very premise for those economics is gone now, right? So we can't act like we can actually bring back those economics. But the point here is that that's obscured. What they're pointing to is the cultural realities of the 50s, right? So let's bring back racism. Let's bring back patriarchal heteronormativity. Let's bring back these cultural garnishments of the 50s. And maybe that's how we can get back to that time where a guy could support a family on working at the tire factory down the street or whatever. So this is impossible. This is a mystification. Nothing ever gets better. When right populists take over, no problems are solved, right? Anywhere in America or in the world where right-wing movements have taken over with this critique of modernity and this attempt to, like, we're gonna, get rid of immigration. That's the big problem. You have a billionaire like Elon Musk saying it's not people like me that are the problem. Of course not. It's the immigrants and the transgender people going around the world and trying to make this case, and it doesn't solve anything. It brings us right back to crisis. It brings us right back to decay. And the conservatives who are behind these movements, when the dust settles on this movement, when Trump's 4 more years are up, they're not going to be happy again. They're not going to finally be satiated. No, their reactionary politics, unless they find a new way, are just going to increase. And that's how we get stuff like more overt forms of fascism. So we have a lot of problems here. And then to the question of happiness. Maybe that's the wrong question to even ask. And we can talk about the utility of even thinking in terms of happiness. But it's kind of a difficult situation. I'm going to have on Todd McGowan, who I've had on many times, and he wrote this book, Pure Excess, and he kind of brings in Lacanian psychoanalytic tools to a Marxist anti-capitalist framework, and he talks about desire, he talks about lack, he talks about this feeling of not being enough that capitalism preys on, and that what we have to do is not mystify ourselves that if we just get something right, that we'll be personally happy. We have to embrace and integrate this sense of just being a human being and having a sense of lack and being okay with that and finding radically new ways to structure our life. So there's a deeper question when it comes to happiness. But how does the left appeal to people? We have a solution. We have a good analysis. We understand where the problems come from. We strike at the root of those problems. We have a vision forward, a blueprint for actually solving those problems, expanding things that Americans say they like personal freedom, like democracy, right? But it's anathema to the current power structure. And so those ideas they're going to be attempted to be remained fringe, right? The whole society, the whole superstructure of capitalist society will try to keep those ideas fringe. They will try to tie those, especially in this, you were talking about the manosphere and this masculinist reactionary politic. They're going to try to tie leftism to being weak, to being soft, right? These ideas of anti-masculinity, and that works on like 15-year-old boys, right, on YouTube all day. And they're going to try to continue to limit imagination. And so that gives us a difficult thing, because We have the tools, we have the understanding, the analytical analysis, but the culture itself is produced by capitalism. And it is reactionary in so many ways. This is a society that is settler colonial in nature, rooted in slavery, maintained by brutal imperialism. That's a long cultural, historical nightmare that weighs on the brains of the living and continues to shape how people perceive the world. So I don't have any easy answers about how to further branch out our cultural appeal. But I do think that we have an economic message that regardless of your cultural aesthetic preferences, cuts to the core of the actual problems in your life. And we see when that is pushed on a mass scale, even somebody, to my right, like Bernie Sanders, he taps into that because he's speaking to a very real economic situation, and he kind of raises his consciousness a little bit. He gets them thinking about, it's us, not me. So you're breaking that neoliberal hyper-individualism and atomization. You feel like you're part of a bigger movement. And at the end of the day, whether we're engaging in spirituality or political transformation, there's something deeply human about wanting to be connected to something bigger than the self. And when life is reduced to the self-gratification, self-obsession, right, fulfilling the self's desire, it is a howling void of a spiritual desert. And so I think the bigger problems of human happiness we'll have to contend with, but fundamentally creating a project that is about something bigger than yourself, that is about creating a positive future, that is about economic self-determination and true democratic control, not just in this fake political sense, but in the everyday machinations of the workplace, of your community, that's something we can strive for. And the only way we're going to get there is by coming together, working together, because we don't have the power, we don't have the money, we don't have the militaries. All we have is raw numbers. Most people on this earth live in precarity. Most people live in toil. Most people have to sell their labor and their time on this planet to somebody richer than them just to get by. And so that's always going to be our advantage. But it's a difficult cultural terrain in the beating heart of global capitalism, imperialism, and that difficulty is not going to go away overnight.
Certainly not. But in the meantime, of course, I think one thing that's important that you've been addressing yourself to is finding those resources for improving, oneself and one's world. Like this dialectic is something where it can't only be for maybe people like us. It can't only be attempting to improve the world without it having some consequent basis in realizing human potential and fulfillment. And one thing that you've said about this is very much getting beyond the self. And this is where it seems to connect very much with the objectives and goals and language and metaphors that you find in these mystical traditions and spiritual traditions as well as ethical traditions, but in a somewhat different way and in a different texture in these mystical and spiritual traditions, is that attempt to go beyond the ego. And so many of the ways in which the ultimate fulfillment and the ultimate goal is characterized in language, which can be difficult itself to really express these things in language, is some kind of loss of that sense of the self that you were also just diagnosing, that when your horizons are framed entirely by this kind of selfish self-absorption, self-gratification, these are destructive tendencies that all of us are potentially subject to. And that, one of the goals of mysticism is to connect with something larger than oneself, and that's a meaningful experience that the mystic seeker is after. It's this elusive feeling of actual absorption and connection with something greater. And I think of that as not just a kind of loss of self, but a wholeness of the self. That somehow, when you were talking about lack, we attempt to fill that sense of lack that everyone feels in the human condition under the way in which we do live today and historically have done so, is a lack, some kind of division between ourselves and something else beyond, some kind of connection that's missing that we're seeking after to try and forge, to establish wholeness. I think of the Arabic word salim, which is the same as the root for salam, which is the same root for the word Islam, the name of the religion, which is often translated as surrender to the will of God, but it has deeper roots in the root word of salim, which means wholeness, being completed. And that's what we're after. In this kind of existence, we feel that there's a lack. And instead of trying to repair that, we try and fill it with things and with, egoistic fulfillment of desires, rather than learning in some way how to make ourselves more whole. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about that goal, the goal of mystical traditions and mystical orientations. You've had a lot of interesting things to say about what enlightenment appears to be, in these traditions. You spoke about it from a Buddhist perspective, but in your conversations with Allison, I was really quite taken by how important really understanding the meaning of the self and what overcoming the limitations and the narrowness of our self could look like, and how that's envisioned.
Yeah, so there's an interesting paradox right at the get-go, because you talk about in Buddhist terms we talk about no self, transcendence of the self, or there's even in Sufism the annihilation of self in God. So there's that aspect of it, and in mysticism there's always these paradoxes. On the other side of that, you have big self. Maybe in Hindu philosophy we talk about Atman and Brahman, right? Small self and big self. And the paradox, the resolution of that paradox is that whether you are everything or you are nothing, it's the same thing, because it's not an inflation of ego. It's an explosion out of ego into everything, or a chipping away at ego until it dissolves and then the realness is there. So in every mystical tradition, they have different language. They have different ways of talking about it. There's more theistic language. So out of Sufism and Christian mysticism, you'll definitely be talking about union with God. I felt, Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven is within you. So these are the terminologies that are used. And so that's the sort of theistic way of talking about it. In Taoism, in Zen Buddhism, and other forms of Buddhism, it's a more naturalistic way of talking about it, right? It's like a natural process. The sense of self dissolves away, and what is left is, when those artificial boundaries of self dissolve, is this profound interconnectedness. In both instances, whether you talk about it in terms of God or talk about it in terms of nature, and I talk about Spinoza's philosophy because he has this beautiful worldview where mind and matter come from the same substance, that everything is deeply interrelated. And he talks about God or nature or God, like however you want to talk about it. It's the kind of the same thing in the end. But the important thing is that what emerges out of this process is what is referred to as non-duality. So it is the elimination of the boundary between self and other. And the ego, the sense of being an ego, which every single person watching can viscerally feel, is the sense of, where are you located? Where are you at? You're not your arms, you're not your hands. You look down at your body, you're not really your body. You have a nose, you're not your nose. So where are you? Well, what it feels like is that I'm somewhere behind my eyes, between my ears, located up here somewhere, maybe at a control panel, right? The Cartesian homunculi idea. And I have a body, but I'm somewhere up here. And I look out of my eyes, the windows of my being, and I see a world that is not me, right? I know that lamp over there is not me. I know I am not Adnan. When I look up at the night sky, that's not me, that's out there. So what comes out of this is, I'm a small thing. I'm a trembling, tiny, separate thing. And I'm going to be annihilated at death. And I am now just implicitly in an impossible position where I feel like I am a visitor in the cosmos, that death is coming around the corner in a couple years, a couple decades. My small self will definitely be obliterated. Maybe I can console myself with ideas that my ego lives on, but if you really think about it, how terrible would that be? But that's a fundamental position that humans are in. And what is gained through enlightenment, awakening, mystical union with God, whatever you want to talk about, is an obliteration of that illusion. That actually you are not a small separate self somewhere behind the eyes, in between the ears, concealed in this bag of skin, one day going to be obliterated. That you are the whole thing. And that you can viscerally, not just intellectually, viscerally experience, once you get past the ego, and there's a bunch of practices and forms of activity you have to do and engage in order to do this, right? But once you get past the ego, you see that you are everything, that you are participating in something profound. In Buddhism, we talk about no birth, no death, right? In Zen, they talk about what was your face before your parents were born? This is a koan, trying to frustrate the ego intellect. Like, what? I didn't have a face before my parents were even born. How could I have a face? Because I'm me, and I came out of my parents, and I'm going to go away one, And so there's a bunch of different ways to get at this. But ultimately is this sense of non-duality. The artificial barriers between you and everything else are obliterated. And that can happen in a big mystical experience. Some people take so much hallucinogenic drugs that opens up for them. That's not sustainable though, and there's downsides and risks that come with taking drugs for this process. But a lot of people will bump into this reality. I did at 16. I bumped into the disillusion of self and other, accidentally being a reckless teenager, taking way too many magic mushrooms, and it obliterated the boundaries between self and other. And I laid in the grass and I looked up at the cosmos and I felt all the stars raining down into me. There was no separation. I was the whole thing. And that only lasted a few moments. I was making a scene. My friends picked me up and I, went and had my little trip or whatever. And it sounds silly and juvenile. But what really hit me is like, whoa, there's something there. What did I just bump up against? What the hell was that? Because in that moment, all my fears, all my concerns, all my anxieties, all my baggage of being a self was obliterated in an ecstatic union with all of nature. And I only had it for a brief moment, but that got me interested and on down the road. And so what is gained in this is that, how does this cash out politically? You chip away at the ego barrier. You start seeing other people suffering as incomprehensibly your own, right? To see even a total stranger on the other side of the planet be bombed, be murdered, face injustice. Your heart can't take it. You start weeping. Every fiber of your being wants to prevent that. Why? Because you're seeing through the illusion of separation. That our fates, our condition as human beings on this planet, our destinies, our sufferings, they're not separate. I can't actually shut myself off from all of that. I can, but it comes at a great cost. It comes at the belittling of me. It shrinks me down, turns me away from others. I'm now fear-based. I'm separation-based. Now I need control. I need uncertainty, right? It makes you smaller and smaller and smaller. These processes of spiritual practice, they blow the doors off your separateness. And then injustice isn't just an intellectual thing that you're ethically against. It's something that you viscerally can't stand. And that leads you into action. How could it not? The false notion that a lot of people have, and because there's good reason, because these spiritual communities exist everywhere, especially in neoliberal capitalism, where spirituality is reduced to this narcissistic idea of self-care. That actually spirituality is about just like taking bubble baths and reading my astrology chart and becoming more and more self-obsessed. Me. What does this mean for me? What can I do for me? How do I take care of me? That's the exact opposite direction that these deep spiritual traditions go in. And you can look at how the Buddha talks. You can look at how Rumi talks. You can look at how St. Francis talks, right? There's figures in Judaism. There's figures in Hinduism. They all talk radical love, radical connection, union with everything, God's love flowing through them, right? Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And I always say that's impossible to the ego. If you tell the ego, love that neighbor that you don't know at all, love him just as much as you love yourself. Be concerned about him just as much as you're concerned about yourself. It's an impossible commandment. What are you talking about? Even if I wanted to, I couldn't do it. Yeah, the ego can't. But Jesus, I truly believe, was operating from a higher state of consciousness. He was in this union state. And he used the language of Judaism and the culture of the Levant to articulate this experience, just as the Buddha used the language of Indian and Hindu philosophy to articulate his message of knowledge, and same with Rumi using the language of Islam to talk about his experiences. But they all coincide. And what you feel is deep connection to all beings, a deep investment in their being all right, and that feeds into an inexhaustible part of you that will seek justice for other people. It should, at least, right? That I can't stand injustice. I can't stand Palestinians being genocided. I know there's only so much I can do, but I'm dedicating my life not to money, not to wealth, not to satisfying more and more of my desires. I'm dedicating my life to trying to make the world a better place for all beings in it. I truly believe that there is necessary suffering. As I was saying earlier, suffering is a catalyst to growth. I would never, even if I could, rob every person of their suffering, their necessary forms of suffering that spur on that growth, because I know that without that, I would not be on this spiritual path at all. I would never have come here if it wasn't for my suffering. But there's so much unnecessary suffering. Capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, so much arbitrary, cruel, utterly unnecessary suffering, and so much slaughter, so much bloodshed. That's the sort of suffering we can take away. That's the sort of suffering we have an obligation to take away. And when you get outside of your own self, when you get outside of your own careerist ambitions, when you stop obsessing about what's in it for me, how can I get more for me, how can I protect me, and you radically open up your heart to other people, and you see your inseparability from everything, there's a natural repulsion at injustice, a natural inexhaustible energy to help and to do what you can. And I think that is what is important in its own right. But when you fuse it with revolutionary organizing, that blows the limits off of trying to transform the world from your tiny egoic perspective. We can get further down the field than we are now, for damn sure. I'm not saying everybody needs to, have a Rumi or Jesus or Buddha type experience in order to make political change. But I do think eventually, if we're really trying to build a totally better world with the vision of overcoming class society altogether, the vision of overcoming war altogether, that does require something more than merely outward transformation. That requires us to evolve internally as well. And then once we start doing that, the inner and outward transformation and evolution, then they're keyed up, right? Then they dovetail and they reinforce and strengthen one another. Trying to do it alone, I'm just going to go in a cave and worry about me and reach enlightenment, very limited. Trying to change the world from a petty, petulant, fear-based, control-oriented ego, it's limited. Bring those two things together, and I think real fundamental change, inward and outward, can be accomplished. And that's what I just urge people to become curious. Don't take my word for it. In some sense, this has nothing to do with beliefs. The beautiful thing about these mystical traditions, you don't have to believe anything. It's about experience. And it's almost scientific. If you do these sets of practices, in Buddhism they're different than in Sufism and different than Christian mysticism, but if you do these practices, you will viscerally experience these feelings, these states of being. And when you do, you will realize they are more true. They are more real than the day-to-day mundane ego consciousness that all of us default to.
Yeah, that's really inspiring, and I think really makes a great case for why some internal work is so important, and why that's what spiritual disciplines are meant to do, is to do that internal work. It reminds me of a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, that Muslims are fond of reminding themselves that God doesn't change the condition of a people until they change themselves. Now, we would say that there are material factors you can change, but it emphasizes that this really, for a really profound and fundamental change, that has to also be involved with how you reorient yourself, your personality, in such a way that you try to overcome, as you were saying, the ego that participates in the divided self, or the sense of the binary, or the division between us and other, between us and the world. And that seems like, in some ways, what you were describing is the spiritual rationale, or the spiritual meaning of what we understand already as a major value of solidarity. It's feeling the solidarity in a more profound and deep way, experientially, rather than just intellectually through our beliefs or moral and ethical commitments, but actually feeling that connection between us and what we think of as outside of ourselves, but in fact actually participates in the same form of being, of existence. And so if we can get the ego out of the way, then we can appreciate that. And but one interesting thing that I thought about in terms of the way in which Sufi mystical spiritual orientations also sometimes talk about it is that, of course, there's that fana fillah, the annihilation of self in God that you mentioned. But there is also many who talked about how after those moments, those flashes, like the one that you experienced, where you didn't have to believe anything, but you experienced some connection to the entire cosmos in a way that ripped the veil, as it were, between, of the false division between yourself and other and the rest of the world. In Sufi tradition, they call these tajallis. These are these kind of like emanations, or akshaf, unveilings, to real things, to reality as it actually exists. That those moments or glimpses that can take us out of the sense of narrow and divided self, they're impermanent. They are temporary. And then you go back and they talk about bust and qabd, expansion, this feeling of oceanic connection that just expands yourself into the universe. And then, but when it's over, this qabd, this contraction, this kind of sense of like loss, and now you're missing that feeling that you can't always have. But that Sufis theorized, or I say theorized because for me it's theoretical, it's not something I've experienced, but what they talk about is also something after those periods and experiences of loss of self and oceanic kind of connection with the universe, with the divine, is also baqa. That is the return and subsisting or abiding with God, with that feeling that even though you're not experiencing it in the same ecstatic, expansive way, nonetheless, something about your living in the world has been transformed by a continuing connection that's made real for you. So you may not be having like hallucinatory visions of oneness with everything, but you are existing in a new way. And that seems to be the goal for our life and living, is to experience that. And that seems to me, as you were saying, a form of radical love and radical solidarity with everything else around you. And if we could experience that, that of course would also have these positive, as we're saying, political and social consequences of putting us in connection with one another, where you cannot feel that somebody else's suffering is tolerable if it is not just a question of their own growth, but is oppression, over them. So that really connected with me, how you were describing that, and also reminds me of a couple of other things that I wanted to mention and comment on.
Could I touch on that really quick though?
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Please remember what you're going to say, because I want to continue that part. But what you said is so important. This opening and this contraction. Now that experience on magic mushrooms when I was 16, that was just the opening. That was just the first time I glimpsed that there's anything other than ego, right? And it was only very brief, and I didn't even understand it afterwards. It took me years to really understand what that was. But subsequently, I have obviously gotten on an actual mature spiritual path of Buddhist meditation intensely over many years, off and on, but periods of intensity. And what has happened is, I kind of sometimes think about dialectics as upward spirals, that you kind of return to things at higher levels. And if you navigate them properly, you level up, you return to the problem again, but from a higher perspective. And I kind of see these spiritual openings as kind of precisely as kind of that, like you get up a rung, right? But what has always, and this is different for everybody, but what has always preceded those moments of opening, and every subsequent time where I've had an opening, it's never been under the influence of drugs. It has always been after a prolonged period of suffering, spiritual existential suffering, that I believe weakens the boundaries of the ego, right? I'm kind of stubborn. So for me, I need to be beaten by the stick of God to have my ego weakened. And when it's chipped away enough, when it's frail enough through suffering, these spiritual experiences come out. So every time, prolonged period of suffering, then there is a radical opening up. And what that opening up feels like every time for me is insane love. That my ego is swamped, flooded out of the picture for several sacred moments. And what is replaced with is pure, undiluted love. I couldn't live in that space all the time because I would just be on the ground washing the feet of strangers. I could not function in society from that perspective all the time. But when it opens up, I've said this, I weep and I feel, I was one time in the, I tell this story a lot, but for your audience, probably they haven't heard it. After a prolonged period of multi-months of spiritual, existential, emotional suffering, I was, meditating the whole time, on the spiritual path the whole time, right? It's not just suffering like I'm just going through something. It's spiritually infused. I'm going to the store outside of Target, and I'm just driving, doing some errands by myself. People are walking in and out. You know how when you're going in the front of a grocery store, you got to, hit the brake and let people walk in with their carts or walk out to their cars. And it just broke open. And, all my suffering completely went away. Love flooded out of me. I was weeping in my car. I loved these strangers, not like they were myself, because I don't even love myself that much. I loved them like my children. And it wasn't me standing over here loving them. It was just radical love. No separation at all. Now, if I got out and tried to talk to one of these people, they'd call the cops. Who is this madman? But so I didn't. But just weeping love. And then what happens? That period of suffering is over. I enter a new phase of growth. Like after the winter, spring comes. I have more depth. I have more compassion. I have more wisdom about how to live my life. I'm not perfect. I still have all these foibles and flaws, but I've went up the spiral one ring, and I've shed certain lower forms of suffering that were holding me back, and I've developed new capacities of wisdom, love, and compassion that even though the door shuts, and I always say the door shuts and there's like a certain suffering that comes with that contraction, as you were talking about, but the door is never fully closed again. The door is cracked. And so you just have one of those experiences, your heart can't shut all the way ever again. You can't look at suffering the same in another person and totally close yourself off from it, right? And then you enter a new period of growth, of spring, of summer, blossoming. And then inevitably for me, comes the autumn, comes a new form of suffering. There's a deeper layer of trauma or fear or control that I need to let go of, that I need to process. So I go through multi-month period of suffering again. Burning, you can think in Buddhist terms, burning your karma. Burning out your karma. You have to face it. These spiritual paths, they are not lollipops and rainbows. This is not about being comfortable and slowly loving everybody more and feeling happier all the time. No, this is about you have to uproot your delusion, your greed, your fear. You have to come face to face with all of your flaws, process them, all the hidden traumas of your life, all the things you push way, way down there, even going back to your childhood. Once you go on this path, you will have to face all that. how could you elevate without doing that? You know, you can't just have a skeleton of closets you never look at and then just live in bliss. And so there's this cycle, over and over and over and over again. So the last thing I wanted to say before you go on to your point, these experiences undermine capitalism. When you have these experiences of radical opening, of love, of deep connection, interconnectedness, you're not trying to go buy the newest iPhone. You're not trying to climb the corporate ladder. You're not trying to become an influencer and see if you can create a course that people will pay $400 for so that you can use your pretend spiritual growth to milk people for money and get a six-figure. You know, all of that stuff falls away, and you see with wide open eyes how silly, how dehumanizing, how brutal and stupid this whole system is. So these states of consciousness, if you want to call it that crudely, are a direct assault on the core premises and effective orientation of capitalism and the capitalist subject. So these are revolutionary in that sense. What does capitalism have to sell you when you don't have any more desire for things? What does imperialism have to offer you when you're no longer scared of the other? The core premises of this entire system begin to break down. So if we can not only have that ideologically, intellectually, and politically, but we can actually start to deconstruct that need for things in ourselves, where the appeals of capitalism and imperialism and nationalism and separation just no longer ring true at all to us, that's a revolutionary act. That's a threat to the very system itself, and that must be repressed. And what has happened historically is that the religious institutions have had weird relationships with these mystical tendencies. Sometimes there's this real populist energy that the church sees, like we can bring people into our fold through a figure like St. Francis, right? St. Francis wasn't excommunicated or exiled like many other mystics were. So there's that tension. I don't want to obliterate that. But in lots of cases, they were seen as threats. That these mystical experiences were seen by the hierarchy of the institutionalized forms of these religion as threats, at least at the time. Maybe later they were integrated. You know, that person becomes a saint now, even though we burned them at the stake when they were talking their shit back in the day. But now we realize, so it's nice and safe and in the past. But there is always this sort of tension between the structured hierarchy, belief matrix of the institutional church and these mystical experiences, precisely because not only does it challenge core premises of capitalism, it's hyper-egalitarian. It challenges core forms of any form of domination, any form of hierarchy that is unjust, any form of oppression. And that can be a threat to institutions which are powerful and wealthy and operate on domination and control, right? So that's always a tension.
Absolutely. Those words really ring true about how radical that opening can be, that those realizations and those experiences. And if you build some kind of politics on that, it really can be something very revolutionary, because it's absolutely antithetical to all the assumptions of capitalism upon which, the whole economy and society is built upon. Aggrandizing, the self in certain ways, about feeding desire. And those are limiting. Those ultimately, as progressive as it has been in producing material benefits and development that allows us to achieve a greater condition of sustainable equality, without class society and class politics. It's an engine of change, but it's an engine of change. It also produces all these toxins and terrible, aspects that have to be repaired, have to be transcended. And that's what we're talking about in some ways, is that radical sense of spiritual solidarity, empathy, and overflowing love, and justice, which, Cornel West talks about as love made, in public, right? That's what justice is that, feeling and commitment of loving, others, the entire, world of being, that has to be put into proper order, that has to be nurtured and cared for. And that empathy is the foundation upon which a politics can be built. It just reminds me that, if we think of Marxist vision as one of trying to achieve human fulfillment of the species being, right? Of like actually fulfilling the potential of this, of ourselves, as human beings. It just reminds me so much of ideas like Ibn al-Arabi's idea of the insan al-kamil, the completed or perfected person, is that made whole and fully as a theomorphic being. This is, of course, in Islamic and Abrahamic kinds of theological conception. But that does break down a lot of the, typical. This is why some of his ideas were considered, heretical, needed to be condemned, and so on, is because he breaks down these barriers between the human and God. Is that the human beings are a theomorphic being, that they have the capacity to exhibit, and not in the same way, theologically speaking, but in terms of being reflections of the attributes and spiritual capacities that have been endowed within the human soul, these attributes of the divine. There's a special connection that true human fulfillment is connecting to that, and which is why there's a famous Sufi saying, based on a hadith, to know yourself is to know your Lord. That is, the more you can really develop and understand your spiritual capacities and align your personality in the ways that you've been describing, the more you know God, what it is. And the other side of it, that Ibn Arabi was very fond of saying, is that God is closer to you than your jugular vein, which is something comes from the Quran. It's like God is with you. So there isn't this separation, and the whole goal is to stop seeing everything through the prism of the narrow, selfish desires of the ego that prevent you from really appreciating that connection. So there was a lot there that was really speaking to a tradition, at least that I'm familiar with. But if we, that brings kind of what we think of as leftist and Marxist political and economic analysis together with the spiritual orientations that you were elucidating. And it just reminds me that, if it is a vision of human fulfillment and potential in a social kind of context, that the human capacity is created through its experience as a social being, right? It's not just, and that's the difference between what we were talking about, ageist spirituality in the era of consumer capitalism, is that it's all about self-enhancement and self-regard and care of the self, only for that purpose, for the purpose of oneself. Whereas genuinely, the paradox of this is that, at least this is how I would look at it, is that true human fulfillment and the potential to be fully human is when you are able to engage with all, with everything, not where you try and control and bring into yourself everything for your own self-enhancement, but that enhancement comes in the act of connection and that sense of solidarity. And so, it just reminds me that Marx, for example, and people often forget this, I think it's in German ideology, argued, of course, that, elsewhere, the very famous kind of discussion about the cry of the heart, that religion sort of gives voice to the oppressed, and that, once you have fulfillment of the vision of a classless society, then you wouldn't need religion qua religion anymore. And in fact, he of course is trying to suggest that actually we need to overcome it, perhaps in its institutional forms, and particularly in the way in which the church as an institution was a barrier, in the way that it was tied up with political hierarchy and capitalism, that it was a barrier to actually achieving this. But he also says the same thing about philosophy. into German ideology, which doesn't mean that in the classless society, in the future that he imagines of human potential, that there wouldn't be creative and disciplined forms of thinking. Obviously, he's not. He's saying, however, the institution of the academic study and the Western tradition of philosophy as a kind of alienated form of thinking about the world as object outside oneself, that this will become irrelevant as a form. Thinking will still happen in profound and creative and freed up ways. And so what we're speaking about really is the liberation from the constraints that prevent us from being fully human. It seems to me that's what mysticism and spirituality, along with the social and material transformation, the political transformation, the economic transformations that we're committed to, those come together in a profound way. And I think it's underappreciated in Marx himself that he could envision something like a spirituality and something like a form of thought that is different from the institutional forms that we've encountered and developed historically, continue to perpetuate under capitalism as modes and methods that we think are providing answers. But his point is that philosophy doesn't actually provide you the real answers the way it's been studied and constructed, but some other way of thinking and appreciating and apprehending the world would exist when we remove the barriers that are created by class society. And I would argue, and maybe you would also think, is also when we realign our personalities, our ego in such a way that they no longer are involuted, selfish, but are capacious and expansive and connecting.
Yes, beautifully said, beautifully said. And that's a really important point about Marxism, and there's so about Marx and his vision, and there's so much there. To be fully human, right, is to be all humans, because we're deeply interconnected and inseparable. You cannot be fully human in the master-slave dialectic, right? The master has his boot on the throat of the slave. The slave is obviously dehumanized, but so too is the master dehumanizing himself in his separation from the other. So to be fully human would mean to be liberated from all forms of oppression and domination, and class society, with its stupidities and brutalities, is a way that humans dominate and oppress each other. And we're supposed to believe under capitalism that, the people that are really rich, they just worked way harder than you and they're geniuses. Elon Musk isn't a 13-year-old boy dipshit, with the emotional maturity of a middle schooler. He's actually a brilliant super genius, and that's why he has $400 billion and your kids can't afford healthcare, right? If you just worked harder and were smarter, it's just so stupid. Who believes that anymore? That whole structure is falling apart. All you have to do is just show us the really rich people in this society, and then you're immediately disabused of the notion that they're geniuses and they work way harder than you and they have better moral character than you. Completely obliterated. So class society in its slave forms, in its feudal forms, in its capitalist forms is stupid, it's dehumanizing, it's irrational, it's unjust, and it's premised on exploitation and brutalizing each other. And you can think about it as becoming fully human. I kind of think about it also as maturation, as a species. We, as human beings, we mature from 3 years old to 5 to 10 to 15, 18, 21, 35, 45, ideally, unless we get stuck along that, that path somewhere and we stop growing. This is a maturation process. And I sometimes can, think of human civilization as slowly maturing. We went through, earlier phases of, whatever. We can think about modes of production and the consciousness that came along with them. And we can see now that we're in like this adolescent phase where we've developed these adult capacities, of deep science, understanding our world. We have the capability now to do things that a few generations ago were unthinkable. We can fly to the moon. Maybe we'll be able to colonize the solar system one day. But at the same time, like an adolescent that is developing these adult capacities, we also have this incredibly childish, emotionally immature aspect of us, and these are in tension. And so now, that famous quote of we have godlike technology with medieval institutions and primate brains is sort of getting at, in a rough and crude way, this tension between this adolescent phase of humanity, where we're still engaging in these stupid brutalities of the past while now developing the capacity to radically transform the world for everybody. And capitalism, you're right, is like this rocket into the orbit. It is fiery. It creates immense amounts of wealth. We have material comforts that people of several generations ago, I mean, we're living like kings compared to, our peasant ancestors or whatever. And so that capacity is real. And so maybe capitalism has to come along to play this role. But at the same time, it concentrates it to the very top, creates all these externalities, brutalizes human beings in the process. Marx had that quote. What is rotten at the core of a system that dramatically increases its wealth without decreasing its social misery, right? How is it that we have been able to develop science and technology and medical institutions to the point where every human being has it, at least in theory, able to live a really decent, dignified material life? And yet we still have every major city of the richest country that's ever existed on human earth littered with human beings sleeping in the gutters, while some asshole has $400 billion and is trying to race other assholes, not only to the moon or to Mars, but to become the first trillionaire. It is breaking down. It cannot go on. So that's a huge aspect of it. But the other thing you said about Marx becoming fully human, and when you talk about this stuff, sometimes Marxists will engage in empty sloganeering. They'll immediately go to, well, Marx said religion is the opiate of the masses. Why was religion the opiate of the masses? Because religion in its institutionalized, belief-oriented form was promising people a life after this one. They were saying, we're sinful creatures. We are meant to suffer. This is your lot in life. Under feudalism, literally the king is a king because God ordained it to be such. So the social order is just beyond your control. Deal with it. But don't worry, because when you die, you'll have everlasting hope and love and peace and whatever, right? And so he was saying this belief system is a form of superstructural social control that sells people, at the very least, an unproven hypothesis, and in Marx's atheistic perspective, a lie that satiates them in the here and now, that numbs them out to their own pain and suffering here and now with the promise of something greater afterwards. And that's great for rich people and kings because it keeps the rabble at bay. I suffer now, life sucks now, but, the meek will inherit the earth. And how I interpret that is when I die, I'll be one with God and I'll be in heaven and all this will be gone. And so that satiates, and what does an opiate do? It's a downer. It makes you okay with whatever's happening. It numbs you out to the suffering that you're dealing with, right? And you can see why people get addicted to that. It's numbing out the pain, but it's also hurting you, right? It's causing more pain. It's destroying your being. So what would it mean to go up that dialectical spiral of religion? Well, there's normal religion, and then we have this counteract to it. So, in crude language, this is not really the dialectic, but we can use these terms. The antithesis of religion, which comes in the form of atheism, right? Which Lenin and the Bolsheviks, Marx and Engels, coming out of the world that they were manifesting that direct attack on religious superstition. We have the Enlightenment now. All these ideas are really up in the air and for question. And the church has been so entrenched in the power structures for the last several millennia of our history that it is a mechanism of oppression. It is a mechanism of control for the czars or the capitalists or whatever. Let's rebel against it. We saw it in the Spanish Civil War. We saw it, with the Bolshevik movements, all of Chinese communist movements. Okay, but does it just stop there? Does the dialectic spiral ever just stop somewhere? Of course not. It continues. So then we go beyond atheism and we come to what we're talking about here. That there are this beautiful kernel of truth as manifests as this tendency within these religious traditions. We can broadly call mysticism, whatever. We've come around with atheism and science. So now let's integrate that reality that these things are not in and of themselves sufficient, but they have a kernel of deep truth in them as well. We don't need to throw science away, right? But now let's synthesize these two things. A scientifically informed, higher form of religious engagement that is not based on mystification, obscurantism, opiating the masses, but is the exact opposite of that. is actually liberatory, is actually emancipatory and revolutionary, right? So then we come back to religious experience at a higher level. And I think that's what we're talking about. Now, what's beyond that? I don't know. We're at this juncture point in human development. So we can only see kind of what could possibly be right ahead of us. And we can see with certain clarity what's come behind us and where we are, but we're still kind of in the fog of our own epoch. I could never pretend to say what's 3 spirals up, but where we are right now, that seems like an obvious thing. And in fact, I've lived this in my personal life. I converted to the Catholicism at age 13. I believed in Jesus and all the traditional ways. Go to church. Literally, heaven and hell exist. Literally, Adam and Eve existed. God is judging you. When you die, you will stand before him and be judged, sent to heaven or hell. That caused some interesting religious movements within myself, but also a lot of fear, right? A lot of uncertainty. Who's going to hell? What people do I love? Like, what do I have to do to fuck up so bad that I'm going to go to hell? All these things. Then I come in my late teens, early 20s, I start getting into science, philosophy. I become what, that movement in the early 2000s known as New Atheism. Now I'm a strident atheist. I'm against everything I believed before. It's all stupid. It's all nonsense. How could anybody believe that stuff? Now I look back at that. That's just as arrogant as the dogmatist of religion. That's just as short-sighted, just as egomaniacal, just as hubristic, that I thought that I had it all figured out, that all these people there's nothing there to learn from, blah, blah, blah. And then I deepened and I deepened and I deepened through suffering, through love, through spiritual practice. And now I feel like I'm trying to integrate this synthesized thing where I'm synthesizing the best of science and philosophy and the Enlightenment or, human development and all these things. Socialism, scientific socialism is coming out of this movement to demystify the world, to de-superstitionize the world, right? To liberate the world from those old forms of mental and physical domination and oppression. So I feel like I'm trying to do that, and more people are doing that. And so it feels like there is this movement inwardly, civilizationally and on the species level, pushing us toward what we would call socialism, right? Transcending capitalism, using where we're at in capitalism, using its own contradictions, resolving those contradictions by coming back to community at a higher level dialectically, and also religiously, spiritually, existentially. Atheism is deconstructionary. It deconstructs things, which sometimes we need. It doesn't really build anything in place. So what you're left with is an empty universe of atoms and quarks that means nothing. Your life means nothing. You're just a monkey that got a little out of control. Your prefrontal cortex swelled up a little too much. Now you are too reflective, but it's all really meaningless, and you're basically an accident of nature. And don't you know that's the highest, most scientifically minded approach to reality? Like everything is just matter, and this is just an accident? Okay. Well, that doesn't really solve alienation. It doesn't build anything. It's deflationary, and maybe the thing that came before it needed to be deconstructed, but you just can't live in a perpetual state of deconstruction. Eventually, once everything is rubble, you have to build again. And so I think as a species, we're coming to that level. We're being forced by crisis, internally and externally, to grow again, to build something new out of the rubble that we find ourselves in.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think I can say from my perspective that I can understand, especially I'm a historian. I, deeply engage with the past and accord the approach and the method that I take to studying societies and peoples and cultures of the past is to, accord them the same complexity and humanity that I would for myself and my contemporaries, but to understand that even though they were just as fully human and intelligent as I am, their world was different. The social conditioning of the way they might think is different. And in order to be able to understand their imagination, you have to have that empathetic kind of connection and study a lot to try and make sense of how a world that, to me might not make sense given the era of technology and science that, I've been reared in, how things, made sense to them. So because I do that, and also because as a Muslim, I've been raised with Well, with a sense of connection to a vast and profound tradition, that developed, which, to be honest, a lot of contemporary Muslims and a lot of contemporary Islam sort of abandoned in its encounter with modernity and its attempt to reverse the conditions of colonialism and imperialism. It had to invent and develop, you might say, narrower modernist forms of Islam as a way of trying to respond to what it saw as the weaknesses of previous medieval tradition and so on. And so as a result, it also denuded a lot of it from these spiritual traditions. It used to be at a time, and I think we talked a little bit about this in our discussion about Sufism on Rev Left, that at a certain point in Muslim history, across this vast terrain of Muslim-ruled lands stretching from Morocco to Central Asia, the borders with China, that Sufism was a mainstream orientation. The vast majority of people accepted it, even if they weren't themselves exactly what we would think of as mystics, constantly having openings to oceanic, experience of divine unity. But the spiritual rhythms and traditions were very important for them as part of their devotional piety, for centuries and centuries. And so we've somewhat lost that, and the effort in my work has been, to reconnect with that, to study some of these traditions, and to find what in this wealth of development of previous mystics, scholars, thinkers, who of course were bound by their time and conventions that they had to live with and conditions that they weren't necessarily in control of, that limited or constrained or gave shape to it in certain ways that might seem less relevant to today, but that nonetheless they were engaged in the same path of trying to seek meaning, to live, these values in a profound way and have some connection to the greater meaning of existence. And so for me, I can understand the attractions that the right presents, or that conventional religion offers in an era in capitalist devastation and the chaos and alienation that we've been describing, that's produced such a profound psychological, emotional crisis. I understand that is an alternative that is presented there. So we could go back to, and maybe it's totally romanticized and not even really well understood, but there is something that is there, that people did have some resources that capitalism has stripped away, modernity has stripped away. The problem is, of course, that is a reactive kind of relationship to that. And what we're trying to think is, and what I try and think about is, well, how could some of those resources still, have the insights? Why do we read these Sufi texts? They have some insights that we're finding profound. How could we find ways to connect with those, to experience in our own lives something that propels us towards a future, and that, I think, is the real task. It's not an easy task, but I think from, just everybody has their own commitments and personality and, their circumstances. For me, Islam, particularly Sufism, but even, just Islam as a whole, is a structure that is meaningful as a resource for this, right? And this is something that's interesting, is that I do feel fundamentally all the different religions and philosophies were profoundly engaged with something like this common human experience and quest for self-realization, and in the way that we've been described, not as a narcissistic, pathway, but as something that connects us with others and to life, in a profound and healthy sort of way. They did them in different ways, and this is this kind of idea of perennialism. But of course, there's also a critique that I would have of that, is that people spent thousands of years developing certain approaches, and there may be some, negative dimensions of where they've accepted certain hierarchies or assumptions, but they also, you don't want to abandon, from my sense and my perspective, and this would be what I would communicate to people, that what I want is a Muslim liberation theology, right? Okay, is that it's still got to be Muslim for those who identify and connect with that, and it's a meaningful tradition. And why abandon resources that are there and that are available? The question, though, is that how do we, incorporate and use those in ways that free us rather than imprison us to, traditions that are no longer perhaps suitable or relevant to the conditions we're facing, or that create boundaries where there needn't be boundaries. I mean, that's, I think, another important problem, that institutionalized religion, just like nationalism, just like class interest, creates, identities around difference or points of difference in order to divide and separate people, in order to justify hierarchies and oppression and so on. So there are, of course, these legacies that have to be confronted. But what it's making me kind of think about, and you've been so generous with your time, so I just wanted to come, so several things you had said and mentioned, and even when you said, the way in which atheism, just like we would say capitalism, as a destructive and progressive force, like you need to clear away certain things, but after you've destroyed and you have all the rubble, you need to rebuild. And several things you've been saying, actually, that resonate. What came to mind, to my sense, is Gaza. Okay, I know you were thinking about it too when you were talking about empathy for people suffering genocide and slaughter, and are resisting that. One thing that has been so interesting, I would just love to hear a little bit more, about how you've responded and reacted to this, is that a conventional Muslim faith has been so incredibly important. I don't mean conventional, I just mean traditional, some sense that, these are not people who are necessarily all mystics and Sufis. As I mentioned, in the modern Islam, there's been a lot of forgetting of those previous. They still survive, and they're still important communities, but it's not at that first access that everyone has when they think of what it means to be a Muslim is, there's Rumi and there's Ibn al-Arabi. Like that's not at people's fingertips necessarily. So we're talking about a kind of traditional, conventional, contemporary form of faith and belief and practice has nonetheless, in some ways, been so important to the resilience, the resistance, the surviving of just catastrophic oppression and suffering, that something from this has been important to these people's standing up and making, I think, demonstrating, that despite all of our advancement, technology, we supposedly have the liberal international, order, rules-based, or international law, or we've got, kind of philosophies now that are egalitarian and developed, and we believe in democracy and human rights and all. What has been demonstrated is, firstly, that is a joke. It isn't a serious commitment. All of what we've congratulated ourselves in modernity and postmodernity about the achievements of modern, technical, and in many cases often framed as Western society is actually just a hypocritical, charade. Nobody believes this anymore, because what's been proved is that racism and colonialism and imperialism were actually, and genocide are actually, more important values of so-called Western civilization. And these heroic people have stood up against that onslaught and proved and demonstrated that there can be resistance to that. And they've given the lie to it. They've asserted their humanity when they have been so dehumanized. And one component and feature of that has been that patience and that resilience. And I have in mind, there's so many videos like this, but there was one video of somebody in a half-ruined hospital, a young man. Somebody was asking him, "Oh, what's happened?" He said, "Well, my brother just died." He didn't break down into tears. You could see he was profoundly affected, but he said, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. He kept saying this through his discourse, which is, God alone is sufficient for us, and he's the best disposer of affairs. In other words, I can take this. There is more. There will be survival. I can take this horrible, rending experience because I can find some meaning in it, and we will preserve ourselves as a people. We will continue to fight. We won't be unbowed. I'm not going to sit here and just weep in front of you. It was like a dignity that he had that I thought was just so profound. And I just wondered, for somebody, it spoke to me very much as well, because of course I'm a Muslim. These phrases, these values, it just meant so much to me. I said, that's a real Muslim, somebody who in the face of such pain and suffering can find something outside himself to connect to persist, and not be destroyed, somehow not be destroyed by that. And so I just wondered, what has it been, for people who, you don't have the same cultural and religious connection, but you're somebody who supports, has expressed great solidarity with the Palestinian cause for freedom against and liberation against settler colonialism. But it's something that I wondered, what has that come across to people outside? Because usually when Islam is talked about, and of course, even in this context, especially, it's characterized as a vicious, savage religion. There's no place of love. It's just violence and terrorism. And these people are, uncivilized people that you could never really have a human connection to. And that's part of how they've been dehumanized, is by being characterized in that way. And so I wondered, what has been, as somebody on the left who's been pro-Palestine and in solidarity, what that has seemed like to you, and whether you see any of that as connected with any of what we were talking, even though it has a more conventional religious form of religion, but is nonetheless still profoundly important in this anti-imperialist struggle, and what we can take as leftists from that.
I love that you're bringing this up. I think it hits on something so important, because it is precisely the faith of the Palestinians that grounds them. You used the word dignity. Oh my God, the most dignified human beings on earth. They are, the Western atheist, liberal sort of disdain of religion. Like these are all stupid. These people, as you said, are savages. And it's the European colonial imperialist mechanisms that are actually the savage, barbaric, godless, undignified, unrooted, disgusting, repulsive side of this coin. And it is the traditional Muslim faith that gives these people this dignity, this perseverance. And why? In part, because they understand, even in ways that are more traditional than what we're talking about with regards to mysticism or revolutionary politics, that they are a part of something bigger, that there is something bigger than themselves, than their their personal tragedies. They have a deep connection with their tradition, their culture, their land. And those things are inexorably intertwined. And those are precisely the things that the modern, deconstructive, atheistic, liberal world doesn't have. We are hyper alienated in the West, alienated from our own humanity. These self-flatteries of we're the leading civilization, these go back to colonial mentalities. They were never true. They were never progressive. They were always a fig leaf over the barbarity of the West. And it is precisely in these situations where that fig leaf is ripped away, the true face of the West, past all of its bullshit rhetoric and self-flattery, is revealed, and the true heroes, the dignified, the more evolved, fully human people, are the people that, interestingly, use this traditional religion as their glue that keeps them together. Imagine an American society, hyper individualistic, hyper agnostic, deconstructive, self-obsessed. How would they endure something like this? They wouldn't have the tools to endure. When nothing is higher than the self, what do you fight for? What do you believe in? What keeps you going? What is your glue when it's just me, 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 me? Consume, 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 consume. There's something more savage or animalistic, using these crude terms, of course, but inverting them, about that empty, spiritually hollow relationship. So when I talk about this coming to a higher synthesis, it is precisely, and you were kind of getting at this tension too, taking what is useful from these traditions, not deconstructing them to rubble, not throwing them out wholesale. That's what the atheist does. There's nothing to be learned from these things. Are all just relics of a undignified, uncivilized, savage past, which in itself has colonialist mentalities in it. No, the dialectician understands there are truths here. There are deep connections here. There are kernels of beautiful truth and connection that must be maintained. And so I don't advocate that we toss these traditions aside. In fact, I do the opposite. I say these traditions have survived millennia. They've survived many modes of production in Marxist terms for a reason. And actually, instead of tossing them aside and trying to create something new, reinvent the wheel, we take the beautiful paths that are already in these religions and we develop them. And that doesn't mean just taking Islam, just taking Sufism and throwing out the rest of it. No, you synthesize the truth of Sufism with the truths of these other religious dynamics within Islam. Bring out what is true and beautiful and persistent through time out of them. And yes, in Christianity and Judaism, in Buddhism, in Islam, also be ready to be critical about those parts that were dehumanizing, that reified separation, that gave you an ego-inflated sense that my religion is best, everybody else is bullshit, everybody else is going to burn in hell for eternity. All religions have that. And that must be confronted. And that's not always comfortable. It bumps up against people's self-identities, right? And their deep religious traditions. But I think there is a way to take and cultivate what has always been true in these religions, what has always been beautiful about them, and bring those along with us into post-modernity or meta-modernity, right? And it is that tendency to say, no, there's nothing of value here. It's all superstitious savagery. That is this hubristic, dogmatic element within atheism that itself needs to be deconstructed and destroyed. That is actually the problem here. So I urge people, don't get lost in the clouds here. Perennialism for me just means that there's something universally human that is being bumped up against time and time again through these different traditions. But if you were trying to find that and strip away those traditions, those vehicles, you lose something essential. And I bet you would probably kneecap your ability to actually touch those things. So if you are operating in the Muslim world, that's the tradition you come out of. Don't abandon Islam. Love it. Go into it. Find the kernel in it, the beauty in it, the path, the mystical path within it. For me, I had a hard time with Christianity. I moved into Buddhism, and that's been very helpful for me. But now I'm coming back to Christianity, which was kind of my tradition, my cultural background, and I'm finding the beauty in it. I find the beauty in the iconography of Jesus Christ on the cross. What is that but not human suffering universalized? Why is that symbol in Christianity so beautiful, so moving? I sometimes will just see Jesus on the cross and weep today, as a post-Christian or whatever you want to call me, because that is connecting to a shared human condition, that we're all on the cross, that we're all slated to die, that we all suffer. And there's something deeply connective about that. To take that and turn that into, well, Jesus is the Lord and Savior, Christ is King, everybody else is going to burn in hell. You are taking a beautiful flower and you're ripping the petals off. And you're showing me the stem that's left and saying, this is what's beautiful. And I think you're doing violence to the religion and to the beautiful aspects within it. And in this case, to Christ's message by doing that. So don't abandon your religion. Go into it deeper, right? Find those beautiful things. And you're absolutely right. Imagine the Palestinians enduring this suffering. They shouldn't have to endure it at all. They shouldn't have to rely on anything to get through it, because this should not be happening. And we are dedicated to creating a world where this is never, ever going to happen again. I would give my life in a second to make sure this never happens again. But imagine them having to go through it with the shallow, meaningless ephemera of Western secular consumer society. That's the only thing when push comes to shove you have to lean on. And I would bet if the boomerang comes back home to the imperial core, and I think it's coming one way or another, financial crisis, environmental collapse, World War III, something's going to come back and smack Western society right in the mouth. And when it does, I think it will be quickly disabused of its shallow, consumerist emptiness. And there will be a reactionary retreat to a romanticized religion and spirituality of the past. But there will also be the opportunity to reconnect with something deeper than the self, something deeper than consumption, something deeper than satisfying your own desires and seeking nothing but comfort and safety forever. And in a society like America, where there's always been poverty, the indigenous and black populations have always lived under the boot of fascism here, but huge swaths of this society have more or less been able to be insulated from the realities of the world and the realities of what their own government does, and from, in lots of cases, real fucking hardship. And when that comes back around and you're faced with that, I'm sorry, but advertisements and the Super Bowl and your Instagram reel aren't going to be enough. They're not going to be edifying enough to get you through those hard times. And it's coming. So I think we as revolutionaries, if we neglect that terrain, if we call 80% of the world stupid and superstitious, we are locked in ego. We are locked in colonial mentalities. We are locked in scientism, and we are doing violence and actually carrying on that brutal Western tradition of flattering yourself, of being hyper civilized and more progressive than everybody else, while actually being the biggest brute on planet Earth. So I don't think that that's a useful tool for us to embrace radical atheism. It might have served a role in previous movements. It doesn't serve that role anymore. Religion is a terrain to struggle on. Religion has beautiful things to offer the human condition. Religion, at the end of the day, is the language humans use to grapple with the infinite, to grapple with spiritual and existential questions that science and philosophy and even art don't even pretend to have the capacity to grapple with. It's a language humans create to grapple with our finitude, our relationship to something bigger, to the cosmic mystery. And we lose something beautiful when we just use science as a sledgehammer to destroy that. And you're not as civilized as you think you are when you're doing something like that. So that's my appeal to Marxist, and that's my complete agreement with you that we would be making a abysmal error if we continue those colonialist disregards of these traditions, and if we say that these traditions have nothing to offer people. Thank God Palestinians have that, and it is just, it's true. It's not even like, oh, they have an opiate and they have false ideas and that. No, there's truth there. More truth than somebody who is completely unmoored from any tradition could ever comprehend. More truth than an agnostic, secular consumer could ever comprehend. And that is precisely what gives them their strength and their profound humanity. Palestinians, in their perseverance, in their continued generosity, in their continued love, they are the best of humanity. And the people dropping the bombs on them in business suits and ties, that's the worst of our nature. That's our lowest nature. So invert that entire colonial mentality and play with that idea. And I think you're much closer to the truth than.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way to conclude this episode. I think, Breht, you've been really generous. It just reminds me to say that, there's the dictum when you were talking about there's beauty there. Allahul Jamil wa yuhibbul Jamal. God is beautiful and loves beauty. This is what, is one of the essences of religion, and certainly the Islamic tradition, and Palestinian resistance and perseverance and patience in the face of genocidal violence is something that has been beautiful. It also, of course, is very painful for us to watch. But before concluding and ending the episode, tell people, the listeners, how they can come across more of your work.
Sure. Yeah. If you like a conversation like this, I would recommend an episode I did. I gave it as a speech at ASU actually a couple years ago, called Dialectics and Liberation. And you can just search that, Rev Left. It's one of our episodes. And that kind of gets more into the realm of me trying to take insights from Buddhism and Marxism and bring them together. And the conclusion out of that experiment is a concept called the Bodhisattva Revolutionary, where you try to live up to the standard of the Bodhisattva, which in the Buddhist tradition is an enlightened and awakened being operating from the heart in Mahayana Buddhism that forgoes final nirvana for themselves in order to come back to samsara and help others get there. As long as there is a single being suffering, I have a duty to them to help. And there's something beautiful and spiritual about that. And then the revolutionary is willing to give their life and give their everything to creating a better world for others. And in both instances, there is a complete annihilation of selfishness. It's not to say that there's no place for being taking care of yourself, eat healthy, get good sleep, love yourself. Don't hate yourself. We're not ascetics here. We're not trying to say, brutalize the body. I have nothing to care about myself. I only care about others, because you run out of steam. There's a dialectical relationship between self and other, and you have to take that seriously. So loving and taking care of yourself so you can serve others, I think there's a beautiful, delicate balance to be struck there. So I don't ever want to be misunderstood in that regards. But more broadly, you can find everything I do at revleftradio.com. It connects with both Red Menace and Rev Left, the social media stuff, Patreon if you want to support it. But that's where I do most of my political work.
Wonderful. Listeners, do check it out. I could just talk with you forever, Breht, about these things. It's just so spiritually renewing and inspiring and fulfilling. And, I love it. You've been so generous. And I just want to say for listeners, do check out Revolutionary Left Radio. There's a lot of both intellectual, political, and spiritual uplift that you will get from that. And also this was a great conversation to have with Ramadan coming up that I mentioned. That's a time of spiritual renewal and discipline through which Muslims try to grow, to reflect on their lives. They do good works, charity. It's about remembering people who are ill, but while especially and poor, but especially while fasting, those who are hungry. And last Ramadan and this Ramadan, I will be thinking so much about the people of Gaza who have been under siege and occupation. And even if the level of genocidal violence has lessened, there still is so much immense suffering. There isn't enough food, water. They're attempting to rebuild their homes and their lives. And barriers are being put up all the time. And they're going to be going through a period of Ramadan with very little to eat to break the fast. And it's just something that, we should be mindful of. And in any way we can support, express our solidarity, and give. There are a number of charities now that are trying to break through the siege in the openings that have been created through the ceasefire agreement to expand the aid flowing so that people can rebuild their lives. So I'm thinking of them this Ramadan. Hopefully you will be too. And lastly, I just want to say, in light of what we had been talking about today, Breht and I thinking about what are some of the tools in the tradition that Islam has for getting to know God. There's a whole tradition in Islam that is connected with similar kinds of traditions in other Abrahamic religions and even other spiritual traditions of the names of God, or the names and attributes of God as a mechanism through which one can know oneself and know one's Lord, as I mentioned before. And so I'm going to be starting a new series in Ramadan that will continue beyond it, but I wanted to launch it in Ramadan, a series on the names of God. And I think, it'll be hopefully interesting, not only for Muslims to take a kind of spiritual and Muslim liberation theology, but also with just a sense and understanding of what that tradition has been of commentary and understanding and of spirituality about the meanings of these names and their importance for people on their path towards union with the divine and self-realization. But, for anybody who's interested in the kinds of things we were talking about today, might find it interesting. So look out for that new series on the names of God on this channel. And until next time, peace and solidarity.